Started. Everybody, warm welcome to everybody in the room and also to those of you online. And thank you very much for being here today. We're really pleased to be hosting this event at HMPW together with Groupe URD, and very grateful that so many of you have joined the conversation. So I'm Juliet Parker. I'm the director of ALNAP, the Learning Network for the Humanitarian Sector. And the topic we're inviting you to reflect on today is one that's very close to our hearts and central to the work that both we and Groupe URD have been researching and engaging with over the last few years. It's also a topic that raises important questions for the humanitarian sector at a moment of significant pressure and uncertainty. So I want to start with a simple but important acknowledgement. While there's currently a growing interest and attention on mutual aid within parts of the international system, mutual aid itself, of course, is not new. What we understand as mutual aid, the ways in which communities organize to support one another organically in times of crisis, has always existed. In many contexts, it's the first response, the most enduring response, and often the most meaningful form of support that people experience. So this conversation today starts from a place of humility. We recognize the inherent value of mutual aid, its rootedness in humanitarian cooperation, and its ability to operate at scale, even when it's decentralized, informal, and largely invisible to formal systems. Our focus today isn't about legitimizing mutual aid or making the case for its existence. That case has long been made by communities themselves. Instead, we are here to critically explore what happens when external actors attempt to support these efforts and what risks, tensions, and technical challenges emerge in the process. It's also important to acknowledge the context in which the event is taking place, which seems to have been the opening remarks for almost every session I've been to. So maybe I don't need to say it again, but anyway, just in case. We are meeting at an extraordinarily difficult moment for the humanitarian sector, and frankly, for humanity more broadly. We're facing politically driven funding cuts, rising needs, protracted and escalating conflicts, and growing frustration with the pace and depth of reform. Nearly a year after the dismantling of US aid, the sector is still grappling with how to allocate increasingly scarce resources, and with deeper questions about whether this moment calls for a reset of existing approaches or a more fundamental rethinking of how international aid operates altogether. This isn't just a technical or financial crisis, it's a crisis of confidence, legitimacy, and purpose. Alongside this sobering picture, we've seen a noticeable rise in interest in mutual aid from parts of the international system. At first glance, these trends can seem contradictory. On the one hand, retrenchment and scarcity. On the other, curiosity about informal community-led responses. Today's conversation starts from the idea that these dynamics may not be at odds at all. In fact, they may be closely connected. What if reconnecting the international system to the already existing ways in which communities support one another could be part of how we reset priorities, rethink roles, and use limited resources more meaningfully? Earlier this year, ALNAP published an initial evidence synthesis that tried to shed light on exactly this question. We reviewed over 200 documents from 25 countries, looking at what happens when external support engages with mutual aid efforts. While the evidence base is still uneven and limited in many ways, several patterns emerged quite clearly. First, when support is flexible, demand-led, and intentionally seeks to share power and risk, it can amplify what mutual aid already does really well. This includes responsiveness, relevance, dignity, and resilience. At the same time, this kind of support can help address some of the common concerns raised about working through informal structures, including questions around inclusion, accountability, and cost-effectiveness. Second, organizations that attempt to support mutual aid in meaningful ways often find that they themselves need to change. They have to adapt their assumptions, systems, and processes related to compliance, risk management, decision-making, and partnerships. Over time, these adaptations can contribute to broader forms of systems change within organizations and across the wider sector. However, alongside these encouraging findings, one major gap stood out. At current levels of support, things appear relatively promising. But we know very little about what happens when support to mutual aid increases significantly, whether financially, geographically, or institutionally. Will external actors be able to maintain the sensitivities and characteristics of support that seem to drive positive outcomes at smaller scales? What risks emerge as funding grows, timelines shorten, and accountability pressures intensify? And is there a way to scale support without undermining or harming what makes mutual aid effective in the first place? These aren't abstract questions. They sit at the heart of many current debates about localization, systems reform, and the future role of international actors. This is why today's discussion matters and why we're deliberately framing it as both a technical and a political conversation. Questions of scale are not just about tools, guidelines, or funding mechanisms. They are also about power, incentives, and organizational culture. One of the most challenging aspects of supporting mutual aid effectively lies in the internal dynamics of organizations, including conversations across finance, legal, HR, risk, and compliance teams, not only within programs. If support to mutual aid is to grow in ways that are thoughtful and different from business as usual, this conversation cannot remain confined to a small group of program champions or advocates. It needs to become more inclusive, spanning different functions within organizations and different types of actors across the humanitarian ecosystem. With that, I want to move to the next part of today's event. So we've invited, oh, no, sorry, hold on. I'm going to pass to Veronique. Sorry, that was my later notes. So I'm going to pass to Veronique to introduce herself and make some opening comments also. Oops.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining and for organizing this together with ALNAP. It is a pleasure to be here today. And I will come back to what you just said, Juliette, just saying that mutual aid is inherent to human survival from the decades, but centuries and more. Yeah, it existed long before humanitarian aid emerged as a formal system, and it appears wherever disaster strikes, and it will continue to appear with or without formal actors. Across our case studies and literature review, including academic research that has been done on mutual aid more in global north situation after, for example, the 9/11 events or the Katrina cyclone, etc. We observed something constant. Mutual aid is always the first response. It often appears within hours before external actors arrive. And people evacuate neighbors, they share food, they organize shelter, they organize and create WhatsApp coordination groups. And this is not anecdotal, it appears everywhere, in the global south and in the global north. In fact, our operational research project is based on a series of case studies, some of them in global north countries and other in global south countries. And we see mutual aid emerging in all disasters situation and more when institutional actors cannot really offer the responses. And yet mutual aid remains largely invisible in assessments, media reports, and funding decisions. It is difficult to measure, often informal, and much of the essential work of care is carried out quietly, very often by women. So it's largely invisibilized. So if we genuinely want to interact with these responses, we first need to understand them. Mutual aid does not wait for the humanitarian system, and often it does not depend on it. The key question is therefore not whether it exists, but how we engage with it without doing harm. So our research highlights three key lessons. First, mutual aid is fluid. It evolves over time. The first lesson is temporal. Mutual aid is not static. It evolves, and there are three broad phases, let's say. First, the immediate spontaneous response. This first phase is fast, emotional, and proximity-based. It is often messy, but extremely efficient, and many lives are saved in this moment. There is a research paper done after earthquake, and it's between 50 to 90% of the people that are rescued by neighbor people going in the street. It's not marginal, it's massive. Second, it's the organized collective phase. As the crisis stabilizes or continues, informal groups often organize themselves. local collectives, volunteer platforms, or coordination hubs. This is often the moment when the interaction with institution or humanitarian actors become possible. And third, the long-term phase. Mutual aid may institutionalize, transform into resilience or solidarity networks, or simply disappear after the crisis. Its persistence depends on many factors: crisis dynamics, leadership, recognition, institutional openness, and community fatigue also. And repeated crises can either erode solidarity or strengthen it. In Australia, for example, community resilience teams strengthen over time through different crises. Second lesson, mutual aid depends on context. There is no universal model of mutual aid. Its form, intensity, and visibility depends heavily on context. Where strong neighborhood ties already exist, mutual aid tends to be faster and more coordinated. In some rural area of Australia, for example, pre-existing community networks became operational immediately during the 2019 mega fires. In other situations, activist networks may reactivate in times of crisis or disaster. In Lebanon, for example, network from the 2019 protest movement played a major role in organizing the citizen response after the 2020 Beirut explosion. In Sudan, the emergency response room grew directly out of the resistance committees formed during the 1819 revolution. But context is not only social, it is also institutional. In Japan, for example, volunteer centers are embedded in local governance systems, and mutual aid is anticipated and supported. In other settings, in fact, in the majority of contexts, institutional response systems are more command and control oriented. Citizens are seen primarily as populations to manage rather than actors in response. In such environments, mutual aid still emerges, but its relationship with institutions can become tense, improvised, or even conflictual. Third and last key lesson, mutual aid also depends on the type of crisis. In sudden onset disaster, often labeled natural, floods, earthquakes, cyclone, or wildfires, mutual aid is usually immediate, operational, and highly effective. People rescue neighbors, clear debris, share tools, food, shelters. The threat is perceived as an external and shared threat. Solidarity is often intense and rapid. In this context, the main challenge for institutions, including humanitarian one, is often technical coordination, safety, logistics. In human abuse crisis, mutual aid is not less present. It is often even more stricter and sustained. In Ukraine, local network organized evacuation chain and digital coordination system. In Sudan, emergency response room became central civilian infrastructure. In migration context in Europe, solidarity networks have been providing shelter and food for years. But here, mutual aid is not only about survival, it can also be a form of resistance, a political act, or a substitute where the state fails or collapses. This changes the nature of interaction. Engagement requires political sensitivity, protection awareness, and careful understanding of power dynamics. The challenge is no longer only coordination, it is also legitimacy, neutrality, and risk sharing. If we apply the same kind of engagement models to all crises, we risk doing harm. So as a kind of conclusion or opening to the next discussion, in many cases, we observe two common institutional reactions to interact with mutual aid. First is to ignore mutual aid. The second is to try to absorb it, formalize it completely. Both approaches are problematic. Ignoring mutual aid creates duplication, frustration, and distress. over-formalizing it can destroy its flexibility, discourage volunteers, and sometimes weaken social cohesion. The NGOization should not be the only option. The real challenge is there an interface, not integration, not substitution, but articulation. This requires adapting to context, crisis types, and to timing. And above all, it requires trust, humility, and flexibility in the way international actors engage with locally driven responses.
Great. Thank you very much. So we are joined by 4 panelists today to discuss exactly this nature of the interface and what is possible or not. So we're joined today online by Saddam Idris Abdurrahman. He's an experienced WASH practitioner and humanitarian program officer who, since the outbreak of conflict in Sudan, has played a vital voluntary role in the emergency response rooms, currently serving on the External Communications Committee. Welcome, Saddam. Also online is Vishal Patak, who was going to be here in person, but unfortunately couldn't because of the flight chaos. He is the senior coordinator for the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute, AIDMI, and has led their work on the integration of humanitarian and climate risk for the last 2 decades. Colleen Himskirk is the humanitarian director at ACT Church of Sweden and a board member of the CHS Alliance, bringing over 20 years of experience working on local-led humanitarian action and quality and accountability. And also Federico Mocca is head of the Emergencies and Humanitarian Portfolio of the Vittel Foundation, where he leads their work building equitable funding pathways for local actors through collaborative risk-sharing mechanisms. So welcome to our panelists. There will be opportunities for Q&A at the end, so please do keep a note of your questions. And also those of you online are very welcome to drop your questions or comments into the chat throughout the session. So I'm going to start with Saddam, if that's okay. The ERRs are a remarkable example of scaling financial support to mutual aid approaches. With this kind of financial growth comes both positives and negatives. How are you experiencing this in the ERRs?
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to reflect what we are doing as ERR and also to share with the ALNAP for the hosting us in this event. We are very thankful for this. I think there is many positive points, and also there is very negative points we want to share also in this event. I will start with the positive points that we know that the funds helps the ERRs because before the fund ERRs in Sudan, they are organized well, and culturally they know something called it like a nafir. Nafir is people gather in the areas and help each other with the things that they have and all the properties that they have to help the people, survivor peoples who are affected within the neighborhood and within the locality area. When fund came, the positive thing that it let these actions be sustainable, more sustainable than in the past, that we depend on sharing some small grants with the some participants from those and here. But when it comes, the positive thing that it let most of the activities be sustainable within a year and 6 months like this. This is one of the positive things. This helped the operational of our operational reach is become higher than what was in the past. We have just reached to a little people, but now it becomes to thousands of people alongside the country by big networks. The second thing that also the technological integration that happened by supporting, we know that there are many, if you are working in a big network like this, we need a very huge network. Lack of internet also need to fix this chain, because without communication in a big scattered areas, working with groups rooted in the neighborhood and municipalities people. If you want to engage with them and coordinate with them, you need very high operational technical quality, and this also help us. The other thing that is we to adapt ourselves, we forcibly being a professional, you know, because we know how we promote ourselves and we know before 3 years how we was and how now we reach, you know, as example, before there is a meeting that help in WhatsApp. Now people are gathered thousands of ERRs groups in Google Workforce to hold a meeting with Google Meet. I think this is one of the technological high support that we get through this ERR and through this fund that we get, I think. Also, we have reporting system also changed, you know, because the needs of donor according to their fund, there is a big reporting needs through F4. Also digital, there is, we are digitalized also our report team, all of this is our, I think these are positive things because we help thousands of people now. They have enough education and learnings that they help them. Even if the crisis is stopped, they are able to meet their life in development situation by fully skilled. There is negative sides are like need bureaucratic, you know, every fund that you need, it's need bureaucratic systematic way because we are not aligned with the international. We are just community grassroots, deepen in our community and work like in a field works. But if we engage with the funding system, that means we need very big bureaucratic. Until to date, we know that there is like fund over $6,000 need signing, need documentation, need several meetings, you know, to agree. And this is bureaucratic, and this will affect the work that mutual aid work because mutual aid, they are grassroots and they work with the community and fast response. And you know, if there is, if they mitigate more bureaucratic system, that make they are become like an organization, and this is what we are not want. You want to be stay as mutual aid groups, just, you know. Also, yeah. In addition to this, the perceptions of the community, of our community, they look at us as one of their yeah, brothers, sisters around. But if you adapt yourself as in a systematic way, they see us, you are like become like an NGO, work, act like NGO. So this way is one of the negative ways. And the demand of data, when the fund is increased and become more, they demand more data. And this will affect the process, like the process of ERRs as they are practitioners. So you are not become a practitioner, you become like a data collector. And this is one of the big issues because the demand of data increase within the increase of fund, you know, and also it become, they want the data become system in very systematic way. I think this is the points that I share negatively and positively. What about the financial art? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saddam. And yeah, really helpful to hear your reflections on the tensions and challenges of, I suppose, institutionalization, which none of us are free from. I wanted to ask Vishal next. AIDMI's, visually, are you there? Yeah, great. AIDMI's work has documented examples of mutual aid and locally led action for many years, yet we feel like there's a sudden interest and focus on supporting it now. What can we learn from the past, and is the current interest really bringing anything new?
Sorry, again, please.
Sorry,
Thank
this
you.
question is-
Thank you, Saddam. Thank you, Julia. Very important. This is an important question because for many communities, mutual aid is not new at all. It is simply how people survive crisis. Communities were practicing mutual aid long before organizations like ALNAP or AIDMI, UN OCHA, or even Red Cross exist. And the affected communities will continue to do so. At the AIDMI in India, we have been documenting and working with mutual aid for more than 3 decades across disasters such as earthquake, flood, cyclone, and now increasingly more on extreme heat. Long before the term locally led action became widely used, communities were already supporting each other through neighborhood networks, informal credit systems, barter of goods and services, shared labor, local solidarity, and much more. One key lesson for AIDMI from the past is that mutual aid is often the fastest and most trusted form of support. It saves time, cost, and efforts, and often has a smaller carbon footprint. When a crisis occurs, people first rely on family members, neighbors, small businesses, networks, women groups, and local associations. This network mobilizes immediately, often hours or days before external assistance arrives. That's what we also seen during 2001 Gujarat earthquake, where initial 48 hours largely responded by local communities. They provide food, temporary shelter, small loans, childcare, and information, and they are often the first to identify who is most vulnerable and what support is needed. Second point, mutual aid is deeply embedded in livelihoods and work relationships. In our work with small businesses affected by extreme heat in 11 cities, we see how shop owners and workers groups support one another during heat waves or economic shocks, sharing water, sharing shared storage space, or temporary credit. These actions are not organized as formal programs. They are built on trust and long-standing relationships. A third lesson from the past is caution. External systems sometimes overlook or unintentionally weaken these networks. Traditional humanitarian approaches can replace local coping system instead of strengthening them, especially when assistance bypasses local actors who have been supporting their communities for generations. So what is now today is not mutual aid itself, but the growing global recognition of its importance. Donors, international agencies, and humanitarian networks are increasingly acknowledging that effective humanitarian actions require strong local leadership. The real question now is how support is provided to the ongoing local, latent, and articulated efforts. Mutual aid works because it is flexible, as Veronica also said, informal and trust-based. If support become overly structured or short-term, as are almost all humanitarian projects and finance, it may unintentionally disrupt what makes this system effective. From AIDMI perspective, the way forward is not for formalize mutual aid too much, but to recognize it, leverage it, enable and protect it through flexible, full financing, support to local organizations that connect community with wider system, and recognition of community knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, for emphasizing the importance of trust within mutual aid approaches and engaging with mutual aid approaches. Vedi, even when mutual aid mechanisms receive flexible funding, are there limits to what volume of funding mutual aid structures can absorb without compromising them? So, for example, the phrase I keep hearing now, scaling out or scaling up.
Yeah, I think this is probably what sits at the core of a lot of the discussions around what the role of international solidarity is in support to mutual aid. Look, the reality is, I don't think we have an answer for it in two ways. One is the fact that Sudan and the colleagues of the ERRs are the first time that we're seeing consolidated mutual aid or a singular form of mutual aid at scale. And you know, it's still quite early in the process. I mean, in the sense that we've been learning, I think, as much as they've been learning, and those pain points that were highlighted are factors of that process. But the other reason why I don't know that we can actually give a real sense of what the absorption capacity of mutual aid is because it also depends on the kind of funding. I mean, we kind of heard it already. I mean, if you think about mutual aid alone, the absorption capacity is potentially enormous. I mean, it's already happening. If you take the 7 trillion remittances and even say 1% of that might be going into the hands of people who then reorganize at the community level and do it, like, you know, the absorptive capacity is there. It's just, it's the kind of funding and the way that it reaches an individual within a group that then decides to pool it with others in order to have an action that benefits a collective or even just the group itself. You know, in that sense, there is enormous absorptive capacity. The problem lies in the kind of capital that we're trying to sort of allocate to mutual aid. And this is where I sort of just want to take a moment to differentiate for a minute what is mutual aid and what is the sort of toolkits that allow us to engage with mutual aid. Because I think the absorptive capacity question depends on our toolkits, not on mutual aid itself. And what I mean by that is sort of if you look at the survivor community-led response or SCLR model, that's a series of tools that allow us the that you can piece together to enable an external actor essentially to identify mutual aid groups, work with them to sort of understand what they are already doing and where exactly, from a demand-led perspective, we can support. In theory, that is an enormously delicate, it's not just in theory, sorry. In practice, it's an enormously delicate process because at any point in the process, and as we've heard already, you can create biases. I mean, we see that in assessments, like, or in the way that you sort of collect data, people respond in the way that they think you want the answer to be so that they can actually get some support. But even in the fact that you might be a local organization, you know, in one case, you're rooted in your community because you happen to be that member of staff of that organization that comes from that community. So you understand the dynamics and you know what's going on. But then suddenly, if you're going within the same organization, you're going 3 communities over, you're an external person to that community. So that appreciative inquiry process is going to be fundamentally different. And I think why we talk so much about scaling out instead of scaling up is in part because the reality of supporting mutual aid is that you need to think in a diversity of ways in terms of how you engage with the community. There is no model, primarily because, as we heard, mutual aid is so different, but it also changes over time. And so what's interesting is, you know, potentially there are absorptive capacities that are extremely high early on, because in a moment of crisis, solidarity is most visible. And I think there's a reason why the SCLR toolkit uses the humanitarian moment as the entry point, because it's a lot easier to see a community, how they get together in a moment of crisis where, you know, everyone's in the same boat, and, you know, in the sudden onset example, or even in a more protracted, where people are getting together based on like displacement and finding themselves in the same place and saying, okay, well, we need to solve X, let's, you know, what can we do? It's much more visible in the moment of crisis. It's much harder to identify that in a more, you know, sort of protracted, long-term, maybe not necessarily as acute a crisis, right? So in that sense, the entry point is easier, so you can push more funding potentially rapidly. I think there's an element also of how the SCLR toolkit creates, and we heard Saddam speaking about this, like sort of the demands that are associated as well with the kinds of funding that we provide. So, you know, I think what's scaling out allows is for certain organizations to position themselves to do that thing that will actually allow mutual aid to deliver what it does without necessarily having to conform itself into systems and processes and approaches that make sense sort of in the upward accountability chain. So, you know, I think in the areas where we've seen real success, it's been there because there have been facilitating agencies or partners or mechanism or vehicles, whatever you want to call them, that have figured out how to, from a demand-led perspective, how to organize themselves in order to A, absorb risk, B, structure flows, but all in aid to one simple reality, which is a locally led resource allocation decision-making process. You know, just to say, like, you know, in other contexts where we see the potential for mutual aid to go to scale in the same way as Sudan, what we're actually finding is that you do need sort of core facilitating agencies that then essentially push the model, you know, who work through other CSOs and entities to scale this out at a larger scale, and that somewhat also changes the way that the, let's say, vehicles need to organize themselves. So I'm thinking in network of network type mutual aid environments where people, you know, the beauty of the ERRs to some degree is that they are quite a structured system, right? They created base ERRs that report into locality sort of systems, and then at state level, and then the local coordination council that sort of helps the information management and flow and the decision making to go back down and stay within sort of that sphere of decision making. You know, in an Ethiopia or in a Myanmar, that exists in a completely different form, and so therefore we need to sort of adapt in how we engage, and that might not necessarily be conducive to scale or to scaling up, or it might actually need a scaling up through a facilitating agency that then sort of pushes out both the model, the toolkit, the co-design, all of the technical support, the financial money methods, you know, to track like where funds are going, etc. And that for me is also sort of a key question. So look, the reality about absorption depends entirely on us to some degree. And that us means sort of thinking about intentionally, am I best placed, am I best suited to play a role in relation to mutual aid? And constantly asking that question, both because you might be in a first moment, but as the story arc evolves, post-acute sudden onset, for example, or even in a protracted crisis, you might suddenly find that you're not. And that constant sort of questioning and reflection that is demanded of any practitioner is critical to that ability to maintain a constant and continuous and sort of at scale flow of or responsive scale of flow of funds. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense, and it very neatly leads me on to my next question for Colleen, but also a really good reminder that, you know, mutual aid, like, there is no one size fits all. There is no uniformity to it, and it will always look extremely different in different contexts, and it will grow and evolve and change in entirely different ways in different environments, which makes it a right old pesky thing for the traditional sector to engage with. So, Colleen, our evidence synthesis that we did at ALNAP shows that INGOs have played a really key transformative role in supporting mutual aid approaches, but at the same time, INGOs are under increasing pressure and scrutiny about their role and position in the sector. And what responsibilities do you see INGOs taking on regarding mutual aid, and what are the risks they particularly need to be ready for?
Well, yeah, maybe just to start to say, our work with looking at Sweden about 15 years ago just said we need to start doing things differently. And it partly came out of work with quality and accountability and looking at how is it that we're actually reaching the affected populations in the way that we want to. but also as a faith-based organization and part of the ACT Alliance, we were having our faith-based local partners questioning us and saying, are you actually doing what is appropriate and necessary and what is relevant? And so we, together with Christian Aid and DKH and Down Church Aid, came together and started looking into this and saying, how can we be more innovative in our work, and started the Local to Global project. And what's interesting, I mean, this was like 15 years ago. It's taken us this long, but through that process and really looking in depth and how is it that we need to change things, developing the survivor and community-led response approach, because we realized the mutual aid was happening. And it was something that is kind of a blind spot, I think, for Western traditional humanitarian action until this reset started happening. And we said, well, how is it that we can support the mutual aid and really be there and really save lives from the early onset, from the hours after a crisis happened, because it's going to happen regardless of whether or not we're there. But if we can support it, then it could, the potential and the efficiency of the work that the self-help groups are doing is immense. So for us, it became a no-brainer, and that we need to support the SCLR approach. And I think part of the responsibilities of NGOs is to get out of the way in some ways, and to support what's happening with the self-help groups, and also to complement with traditional humanitarian action when it's needed. And I think, you know, now mutual aid is starting to be, it's becoming a bit of a buzzword, and how do we move that? And part of that reason is because of the massive access issue when the Sudan crisis happened. And that's how the ERRs, I think, received and became quite visible in the work that we're doing. And it wasn't because, oh, this is more effective, this is more appropriate, we're more relevant. It was in a sense that NGOs and the UN couldn't get access. And I think we need to shift that. And it's not about where is it we support mutual aid where we can't get access as traditional humanitarian actors. It's about how do we do this so that we can scale out and then complement when needed. And the work that we've done with SCLR, what we've seen is not just in Sudan, but we've seen it in Gaza, we've seen it in Myanmar, we're currently seeing it in the crisis in the Middle East, where traditional humanitarians taking time to set up the system. How do we make this happen? How do we respond? Where are the people moving? Whereas where we have continued to support SCLR and self-help groups, they were responding within hours. So I just also want to talk about the responsibility that we have as NGOs, but also as a sector, is that given the hyper prioritization that is happening right now and the support, I think NGOs have a responsibility not only to go where in those locations what's being prioritized, but also in the fragile context, the forgotten context, the underfunded context. And SCLR isn't just on rapid onset and humanitarian action. It's also about working in protracted crisis and working with resilience. And where you have been providing that support and working with SCLR continuously and long term, that's where you can continue to then also support it when a crisis happens. So I think it's also about continuing to be there. And we know because of now the deprioritization of funding to development action and fragile contexts that humanitarian needs are only going to increase. And so NGOs, those of us who can support SCLR, I think we're going to make a bigger difference and to try and decrease the immense amount of humanitarian needs that we're going to see. I just also want to talk, I think, about the risks. And there is still a lot of learning to do and lessons learned. And it's really happy about ALNAP and URD doing this study and looking into it. But I think some of the major risks are just NGOs and the system getting out of the way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what all the speakers have been talking to. And it's about how do we manage due diligence processes that we have internally when really what mutual aid needs is trust, solidarity. It's about shifting the power and about flexibility. And I think, you know, we have to not talk about how is it that we change the mutual aid system to meet the traditional humanitarian system. It's about how does a humanitarian system change to support mutual aid and to really keep sight of what our aim is, and that's supporting affected populations. We don't need to change their system. We need to change our system. Oh,
thank you very much. Yeah, Which brings us on to a whole load of interesting questions about the ability, willingness, or otherwise of the sector to do that, which might be, yes, a long conversation. What I want to do before we open it up for questions from colleagues in the room and online is just to go back to each of the panelists and ask you, what are the key questions we all need to be asking ourselves? Freddie, I'll start with you.
Is it implementers or funders?
Well, you pick.
Okay, I'll speak from
Or we the collective even.
be the collector. All right. I mean, I think look, answering sort of, I think the fundamental question is always sort of, am I best placed to be that intermediary player? Is the number one question that everyone needs to ask themselves, especially in the international community. Am I responding to a demand that's coming out of this organic mutual aid sort of action that I'm seeing in front of me? And then I think from a funder's perspective, the question is ultimately how, well, from a philanthropic funder's perspective, how do I de-risk this so that we can create vehicles, mechanisms, processes, or whatever it is that will enable these guys to be protected from the madness that comes from international solidarity, and then have discourses with sort of bilaterals to think about how those more structured funding flows can then come in thereafter, but on the basis of something that has shifted perhaps from the current system towards where mutual aid needs us to be.
Great, thank you. Vishal, are you online still? Same question to you. What are the key questions we need to be asking ourselves?
Well, there are two questions come out. One is, how do we consolidate trust and shared learning between communities, local organizations, donors, and international actors? Because a mutual aid system hold a great deal of local knowledge about how people cope with crisis. So creating space where these experiences inform global humanitarian practice is essential. Another one point is how mutual aid can be supported not only during crisis, but also in times of preparedness and recovery and in anticipation. So that's what this point is also come out based on AITM's work with small business and local groups. We see that mutual aid often continues long after the emergency phase, helping communities manage ongoing risks such as extreme heat, floods, and economic disruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and that echoed some of what Colleen was saying as well. So, Colleen, key questions?
There's so many, I think, questions we should be asking ourselves. I think one thing that's interesting during HNPW, what I've been hearing is it's almost like we're saying INGOs against local NGOs. And it's like that's where the issue is. And if we could just maybe get rid of the INGOs, then we'll fix the system in a way. And I think we need to, we need to relook at it. It's the whole system that we need to look at. And INGOs do play a role, but we need to play a different role than we do. And how is that complementary? Because SCLR doesn't work without the local organizations that are placed, and then identifying the self-help groups. Then also, how do we advocate back? And the key questions, how do we get the back donors to realize that we need to change the way that we work and the trust and the solidarity so that we can support these self-help groups? I think also working with communities of practice in SCLR and the importance of that, and more really letting go. How do we let go of that power and that control? Because we're still going to have the funding in the next 10 years. Act Church of Sweden, whether or not we receive back donor funding, we do have funding from our congregations, but how is it we do it in a responsible way? Yeah. And I also think another thing what we really do need to look at that hasn't come up yet, but it's a big question for me is how do we look at risks and risk sharing and not risk transferring? The local self-help groups, the women's groups, the youth groups, the church groups, they are taking on such huge risks in the work that they're doing. How is we look at risk sharing or support to the work that they're doing? And lastly, I think one of the questions that we need to really look at, and I hope that in a few years when we come back and have these discussions, that we need to continue to not do what's comfortable and not do what we know what we're used to. I think as humanitarians working in the traditional sense. I mean, even when the crisis in the Middle East started happening, and even myself, who's really passionate about SCLR, so we need concept notes, and we need to look at this, and we need the project. Wait. We have some SCLR going on. We can provide support. Let's contact them and make it happen. So I think we need to stop doing what's comfortable and what I know works, and really continue to challenge ourselves and really always remember, why are we doing this? And it's to reach out to affected communities.
Deinstitutionalizing our own
De-learning,
assumptions
yeah.
as individuals about how we even interpret our own roles and responsibilities within the whole kind of system.
And it's hard.
Saddam, same question to you, please.
Yeah, I also have two questions. One of them is how we can position mutual aid as core humanitarian work rather than just depend on them on emergency response where the situation is dire, where the conflict zones are widening and the NGOs, UN agencies, they are not work, just they let the situation to the community to handle it. How can this means in very hot locations, mutual aid can work and also can assist in stability of humanitarian. How can we put the mutual aid in a core humanitarian? This is one question. The second thing is how can we uniform the reporting modalities for all the fund mechanism, because as we know, mutual aid are local practitioners and it's better for them to the intervention rapidly help their communities than just try to navigating the different reporting modalities and different donors needs and different donors requirements like this. These are two questions. There is questions in the chat. How I want to answer, but is the time suitable to answer these questions or later?
I think we'll come to them in 1 minute. So please do hold your answers on that one. I'll hand to Veronique, who's then going to also handle the Q&A.
Okay.
I think I'm so passionate with the subject that I didn't present myself and the work we are doing. So if I can just take the opportunity to just say that at Groupe URD, we are working on mutual aid in times of crisis, and I'm co-leading a operational research project on mutual aid in time of crisis. And as I said, we do so in global North context and global South context, which is really interesting to see how things are the same or not always the same, but not comparison, but learning from different perspective. And I really invite every of us to remember during COVID who were the people that really matters and care about you. And just, mutual aid is not always about other people far from our country. It's for everybody in times of crisis. So this is something really important I wanted. And I have some presentation of the case studies we did available for you, and we'll share some the link to the research page. Coming back to the question I have many, but if I have to pick a few of them, just to start again with, it's not how to interact between the humanitarian system and mutual aid is not only about money, of course, but let's say it again, it's about recognition, it's about giving place, it can be supporting peer learning, it can be many things, not only about money. And we said it already, but we are newcomers as humanitarian actors into the mutual aid system. In many situations, they don't need humanitarian actors to come in. They are into their local ecosystems, that is fit for purpose, yeah, with local authorities, legitimate to coordinate with local businesses, etc. So, but if we want to try to do something, then I was thinking those 2 last days, are pool fund, country-based pool fund, a way to go and come closer to mutual aid? I would say maybe, but yes, they have to transform themselves quite a lot, yeah, in terms of processes, in terms of documentation, and in terms of capacity to really decentralize, because country is centralized already. Country-based pool fund is talking about mutual aid. We are talking about little villages, places all around the country or the area hit by a disaster. So are country-based pool funds able to decentralize and transform themselves, and us not transform mutual aid group into NGOs? That could be one of the key questions. And the second interesting development is those area-based coordination model. Again, if area-based coordination model can support local ecosystems, why not? But if area-based coordination is imposing the humanitarian system of coordination with humanitarian principle, including neutrality, I think that in many places, this will become a difficulty. Because as I said earlier, many of the mutual aid groups come from activist groups, comes from, and this is good, please. Yeah, this is, they are fighting for democracy in some places, for freedom in other places, for right for some groups, etc. So we have to revise what is absolutely needed in terms of humanitarian principle and what is becoming a barrier to connect with. Yeah. So these are the big questions, I would say, from my side. I have a problem because I'm getting out of energy from my computer. I'm supposed to take the questions.
See, also Saddam is busy writing answers in the chat as well, which is really
excellent. So there was a question. So now we are entering into the Q&A session, starting with one question that came early into the discussion and was for you, Saddam. How do you deal with accountability aspects, since there were some communities during this current situation who lost basic documentation parts? Yes, this is a question for you, Saddam.
Okay, I ask it, is they mean that documentation of situation at all, or just documents like ID of people during the, I'm not get his point really, but if they mean the documents for the accountability during the process of implementing activities, yes, most of people lost, particularly in the western side of Sudan. So most houses are burned, localities, people lost their things because of internal displacement. But at the same time, some of them, they save copies, ERRs members, they, even if they haven't, we have like depend on videos to show that how our works and how we get funds and how we implement our activities. Also engage with the communities in an open meeting and tell them how we manage this. So this can minimize the risk of the lack of accountability, if I get your question well. Yes, over.
Thank you.
Maybe we will come back to you later on, but there was one question for who wants to discuss this about greening practices. Is there an articulation between greening practices and mutual aid? I think, Colleen, no.
So between what practices?
Greening practices.
Not sure I understand the question.
I understand it. I think it's, you know, carbon footprint for humanitarian aid that we have to reduce, and greening practices from the humanitarian system.
Mhm.
How does that connect with mutual aid? That is a question coming from Sonia.
Sonia. Don't know if I can give a real technical answer to that, to the greening, but I mean, in a sense, being able to support mutual aid and self-help groups means there's a lot less flying in of humanitarians to do the work, and a lot less of a global footprint, because it's often with self-help groups and mutual aid, it's what's within the community, what's within the local area, and a lot of the relevance of what needs to be. Yeah, where can you do the procurement? And it's much more locally led than it is when you have larger INGOs coming in. So I'd say we haven't done any kind of analysis on it, but absolutely I would think from a climate perspective that supporting mutual aid is much better overall.
Maybe we can just give the floor to you and collect some question, let's say 3 or 4, and then come back to the panel. Yeah. Please.
Thank you. I'm a very simple person. I'm the 4th time, I think, in Geneva, and I always feel uncomfortable because it's a big system, important people, a lot of power, and I feel I don't belong here. And it's always about the system, and it's very agency focused. And I heard a lot of good things. I think I cannot change the system, and the system is something foggy. And I always hear a lot of new buzzwords the last 20 years. What I reflect is I cannot change the system, but I can change myself and I can change my attitude. And this is something I'm missing in the whole discussion, because I always feel it's out there somewhere and it's disconnected from myself, and it's always system reset. It's in crisis. I think it was always in crisis. Now there's less money. It doesn't change the system. The system is still there, whatever the system is. So with myself, I can change my attitude and my mindset. And what I'm always missing, and my alarm goes on when I only hear about needs. People always focus on needs assessment, and I'm missing capacities and focus on capacities and opening space that the capacity can come out. And I always think, you know, okay, what I know, I signed it and my organization signed it, the IFSC Code of Conduct. Principle 6 says the humanitarian response has to add value to local capacities. So if I focus on the capacities and not only on the needs, it can be a game changer. If I focus on trust, and I'm struggling writing a log frame, but I'm not struggling having a beer or coffee with somebody and listen to somebody. So I always feel that whole system and conversation and everything here, it's like whining, yeah, there's less money. I'm sorry for everything about that, but I cannot change that. So sometimes I have to finish somewhere, but I'm lacking that, and there's always new buzzwords and whatever. But I want to start with myself, and the rest for you, I don't know, but I can do something. And what I learned, it takes a long time to get fired. So if I take my space, really, like, what risk? You know, we're talking about risk, you know, and risk about anybody, but what am I willing to take a risk, you know? And it takes a long time until I get fired. But do I really use my space for all of this? Or do I say I would like to do something, but yeah, the system. So it's just a comment.
But can I actually respond to that? Sorry, because we had a discussion just internally last week in my organization, and those who are working, and we had a meeting with Local to Global, and it was like the Local to Global team that in practice who work with SEL are saying, you need to stop talking about needs. It's about capacities. It's about opportunities. We need to stop focusing on what are the needs, but looking at that. So you're saying exactly what we're learning through working, and SELR is a buzzword now too, but really it's a tool that we use so that we as an INGO can support mutual aid. And yes, it's maybe a bit of a buzzword, but it's a way that we can communicate it internally. And I have to say, my organization and the way that we're supporting humanitarian aid, our identity has changed. And it's required us to have completely different tools and how we look at it in order to support that, while at the same time, we're still working in the traditional system too, but we have both going at the same time. But it's a real challenge. So thank you.
And if I can just build on it, like, you know, something that really struck me about mutual aid, having now sort of been working at really dedicating all of our time to supporting it around the world, I really feel like mutual aid offers some answers to some of the big buzzwords that make us feel a little bit like incapable of doing anything. What does decolonizing aid look like, really, like in a meaningful way? You know, I really truly think that mutual aid is society showing us how they might be renewing or maintaining their social contract. I mean, it is a social contract. It's me giving trust to you, to my neighbor, and helping them out. And that social contract is the basis for anything to be built off in the future. You can't have development without security. You can't have security without trust and reconciliation. If you're coming at, you know, when we think about colonialism going into authoritarianism and going into aid dependency, which has been pretty much, if you really want to simplify it, the trajectory of a lot of the countries where we are in protracted responses, there is a problem that the social contract has been broken at the very grassroots. And mutual aid is showing us that the contract still exists. It just needs to be supported and recognized and empowered and all those words. And I think we can do that as people engaging with mutual aid and unlearning the things that we thought were making us better professionals. I think that's the number one, and there's people in this room who know this better than anyone. The unlearning process is really hard, but it can be done. They have done it.
One, two, yeah. Let's take.
Hi, I'm Veronique Barbara, I'm an independent consultant. Thank you so much for the panel, and Federico, thank you for mentioning the social contract. I think it's something we should really reflect on as humanitarians and what's our role in undermining it. I wanted to come back to a point that Colin raised, and I wanted to push you a little bit on this. So how do we move beyond that no access situation where when there is no access, suddenly mutual aid seems to be more visible, more readily supported, and move that to situations where the international system still has access, but still is recognizing it. And I wonder how that links to risk and the perceived risk that donors, international organizations, maybe even philanthropic funder see in supporting mutual aid, and how to try and change the equation so that we do go beyond supporting mutual aid at scale in situations where the international sector still has access and could be implementing, but instead is actually recognizing and supporting these mutual aid groups. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's walk the talk. I mean, just do it. If you're, so it's because actually, we're not going to impact the UN or huge NGOs, but what we can do is we can demonstrate that this is possible and that we can support it. And many of the other ACT Alliance members, Christian Aid, DKH that I mentioned before, DC, we're just funding it. We're just do it. And luckily, we are faith-based organizations that have own funds that can contribute to this. And we can demonstrate to our back donors that this actually does work. So walk the talk and do it and continue to be there. So don't just do it when it's an early onset, but continue with the resilience work so that when another crisis happens, the communities will pivot anyways because they're there and organized, and you can continue to support that. And I think I'm really happy about ALNAP and URD doing this work on mutual aid, and I think and demonstrate there's still lessons to learn, there's still things to figure out. It's not all perfect, but there's a lot of good things that came out of this and demonstrating that this actually does work. And one of the things that we're seeing, and many people ask, well, what about accountability to affected populations in this? And are you able to demonstrate that you're following the accountability requirements? And what we're seeing is that the accountability mechanisms are there because it's within the communities working together. And so it's already built in because the communities are supporting one another. And through the SALR approach, they're making decisions based on what the community needs and doing that and making their own decisions. But it would be great perhaps then also to continue to build on this evidence so that we can demonstrate that it's already there and it's built in because it's people supporting people that are part of the community. Sorry, so that was to answer your risk part. Yeah.
You know, I wonder if you kind of maybe answered it already a bit, but it was going to the point you were making earlier about, my name's Nora, about mutual aid theoretically being able to absorb trillions. But then I can't remember, it was maybe Saddam who was saying that, you know, the bigger the funding values or requests, the more compliance that comes with that, and around de-risking. And I guess one of the concerns is around also safeguarding risks, considering even within very established organizations who have tons of safeguarding training and accountability mechanisms, we have issues. And so of course, in an organization with that might not have any of that, the risks could be a lot higher, especially as you know that we think about sexual abuse, it's the people closest to us, and with big amounts of money going, we're really warping the power dynamics within that space, which could be used for good, but can also be used for other motives. And so like, how do we get around that without then trying to add bureaucracies and compliance and NGOizing and maybe it is that with some mutual aid groups, there are strong accountability mechanisms in place, and we just need to learn more about that. I know with some there aren't, and so how do we navigate that well? Maybe you know.
I don't know. Is it for Colin or is it something? Do not hesitate, Vishal or Saddam, if you want to contribute to the discussion and respond to some of the issues that are raised now.
I guess I meant it because I know that the groups and so on are also super well established. There are some of these mechanisms in place, but in other contexts where that is less the case, thinking about bigger financial transfers there and how others are navigating that without trying to add compliance or push groups to NGOs. Yeah.
Maybe waiting for Vishal and Saddam if you want to come in, but for us it is that's why we think we talk about scaling out rather than scaling up. So it is really about keeping the grants small, and because we don't want to make an we don't want to replicate the system. That's not the point of this. But I think there's also another risk if you make the grants too big, and that it takes, with smaller grants, it gives space for non-traditional sort of the non-traditional actors or leadership, so women, youth, people with disabilities. And if you have too large of grants, then all of a sudden it becomes much more challenging for those groups to actually gain access. And so we want to keep the grants small enough that to allow that space for non-traditional sort of groups to get access and to increase that. So I think there's absolutely both, but then there is the point where how big is the right amount, and that's always a challenge, and it depends. And I know when we started supporting and working with SALR in Ukraine, it looks quite differently than it would in other contexts. And so again, it goes back to it that you have to contextualize the support and the approach.
Well,
I want to add something, but I want to make sure that
the other.
Right, well, then I'll just say, I mean, I think the answer lies in a plurality of actions and actors. I think we constantly, and I get it. I mean, I do it to some degree. I'm sort of being told to reduce the number of grants we do a year to sort of free up more time to do more strategic stuff, all this kind of things. And it's like, the reality is that then as a result, you're doing bigger funding to singular players. And this is kind of the system at work in every way, right? But the reality is that there are sufficient groups and actors out there. It's up to us, it's incumbent on us to explore different players intentionally. So do I want to reach especially ultra marginalized groups if that's the case, then find the right intermediary. It's incumbent on us to do the legwork as funders, I would say, and then as intermediaries, I think again it's a question of sort of, if we're talking about everything about thinking of it in terms of a social contract, it's like, where do you stand in that social contract? So, if you can build that relationship that enables you to engage with a group to then capture the information around where there might be schisms or appropriations and things, then you can probably quite rapidly get that data back and adjust your work. But you need to have that relationship at the basis, which is why sort of at the end of the day, supporting mutual aid is mostly about sort of thinking about your positionality in relation to who you're trying to support and at what time and in what place. So I think, we constantly think of risk as something that is on the sort of at that recipient level, or in terms of what's happening at the community level, so separate, distinct from us. I think we need to think more about how we absorb it and our actions, how our actions ultimately play. And that's ultimately, I think, was the biggest takeaway from the ALNAP desk research, is like, there are risks associated with scale, not because of what can happen on the ground, because of how we interplay with a lot of money. Unfortunately, money does corrupt. I mean, it happens within families sometimes, right? So it doesn't corrupt in a negative way. It just creates fissions and tensions. So like, recognize them, build around that, and do that unlearning and relearning to think about how you're reinforcing social contracts or relationships as part of any action that you do, and think about who you're putting into the community facilitator role. So the recruitment suddenly becomes really, really critical. So, invest in those parts of your system that enable you to be a better performer for mutual aid.
Question, yeah.
Thanks. I'm not an expert in mutual aid at all, so I find the discussion fascinating. I think I'm your target audience as well. I work at the Peace Nexus Foundation here in Switzerland. We work with both international actors, local actors, humanitarian, or however they describe themselves. The question I would have is about the conflict I mentioned. And I can imagine that in context of high polarization or crisis that come from armed conflict, how does that play out in mutual aid, and who gets to benefit or not, who gets excluded or not, and also on the positive side, the kind of power that mutual aid can have for social cohesion, and under what conditions of support can this be leveraged? So I just wonder about that.
So an online question as well. Would appreciate your thoughts on how the mutual aid network navigates on security and safety when working, and how that might differ in external and international organizations. And also, Vishal did have his hand up earlier. I wondered if you had something else to add on the greening. Maybe that was because you mentioned carbon.
Yes, but then the discussion was very much interesting, so but I wanted to share a couple of points. I really, based on so far discussion, I found that it's really important to look at and read and study the women movements and environment movements, which really, very much fundamental and realistic points that sharing for us is that what is coming out and what is the characteristic, how, when, what factors around the mutual aid. That's the really, good learning source for all of us. And another one point, it is, one point we really need to remember that based on our experience, I found very useful is it is always very much easy to see and list out vulnerabilities, but equally very much challenging about the capacity that at ground level it is exist, and how we can shape and support this. And this capacity reflects much more around mutual aid and how it, supporting and sustaining it. So these are the point, and we found very much thanks. I think in the beginning it was reflected about appreciative inquiry, where we are not going with any list or tools, but we go with careful and listening them, affected people and community, that what is going on there and how they are dealing with it, the existing risk or response and recovery and preparedness aspect by their own. They may not call it as like adaptation or resilience, but in their own language, but many things around mutual aid and sustainability. Thank you.
I just had one more question from online because the other ones were on conflict and insecurity, and it's on that theme. I'm interested in risk of violence against or the consequence of securitization of mutual aid actors by parties to conflicts, and how the international system can provide an umbrella of protection rather than using this risk as a reason not to fund.
Could we maybe just like flip that question around a little bit and just ask Saddam how they deal with it in Darfur?
Yeah.
So, Saddam, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Hey, this is Josh from P2H. The question was, how do you deal as a mutual aid group with armed combatants? And how do your systems sort of adapt to allow you to do your work? So maybe can you give like some examples of how in Darfur, different base rooms handle this issue and how you use your resources to manage it?
Okay, thank you, Josh, for these questions. In Darfur, it's very different, particularly in most areas in Western Sudan, because there is different territories, like 4 groups now, they share controlling the different territories. According to this, ERRs are working there. I know organizations alongside, just they focus on safe area, but most area are the whole humanitarian assistance are came through ERRs and their partner. As examples, we know that the structure of administration in Sudan is after the government the government gap in whole Western Sudan. There is native leaders, and there is also traditional leaders, and there is also community leaders and ERRs group works. So all of these are interact together. Like, for example, we have native leaders are also members of ERRs, and they are sharing the decision. So when any difficulties come, like put some members of the ERRs in the jail, they also negotiate with the different parties to let them free and work. And also they hold a press conference with the community in open areas to let them know how their works and how this help our communities to provide them their basic needs. So they become part of this, and they know that all of these activities are like local government. These networks are their own local governments, and they protect them from any groups that want to target them, even by negotiation, by networking within the ERRs in other parties. There is media concerns and constraints that you must guide it on it as ERRs, because the different territories parties, so they share these parts. And if you indicate and share information or media press on other side, maybe the ERRs in the other side affected, all of these things you take care all of this during you are working in a big network. At the same time, you need to navigate with the different territories and the security to let your ERRs members work without any harms. So it happened, but we are able to navigate because they having other options also. They just treating the situation like this. Thank you.
I'm a bit on a different topic. I don't know if my name is No, thank you so much. Katrin Fischer, I'm from the UN Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. So thank you so much for all the presentations, extremely interesting. So we are a pull fund trying to support local grassroots women's rights, women's-led, youth-led, young women-led organizations in by now over 40 countries in crisis and conflict. So many of the challenges, despite being in the UN system, it resonated very much with us as we are trying really to enhance our funding so that it reaches the ground. We have something called the scale deep, so deeper into the ground to support organizations that especially have not been supported, and also trying to get to support as much as possible non-registered organizations, especially in line with refugee organizations that, you know, in countries where they maybe cannot officially register. It's a bit challenging, as you can imagine, also in the UN system, to create some change. So I wanted to pick up I think Vishal mentioned women's groups, and I wanted to maybe also from your research hear a little bit from your, of course, also the practitioners, everyone, the gender aspect of it, and in how far women's groups, may they be informal or formal, what role do they play? And as I said, we're trying to open up that space more and more. You know, the support needed to these groups. I'm curious to hear what your research experience says about that.
Vishal, if you want to.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for raising this question. And this is, you know, from our practice, from our work at AIDMI, we found that, you know, while working with women is, you know, it's really provide the higher chances of ownership and long-term sustainability, because they are taking ultimate responsibility of food security and education, home care, along with livelihood. So while in several cases where we studied and implementing different projects between two disasters in the same location, and so that was really very huge, you know, learning opportunity and lessons that, and what we found that women group take that responsibility in a much better way and see the comprehensive as a home, family, entire, not like just one only income, but it is also about the food and livelihood system. So by that way, that's, you know, much more around mutual aid, also around the sustainability aspect went well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can invite you. We did a webinar on mutual aid and gender issues, and it's recorded and translated because it was in French. So I first indicate where you can find it. And indeed, yeah, many mutual aid activities, care activities are taken care by women and largely invisibilized. So I think it's really a cross-cutting issue, something embedded with mutual aid, the role, differentiated roles of women and men, and access to some support may also become in some places an issue. Yeah. Thank you for raising this issue.
Hi, I'm Brona with Stand Church Aid's DCA based in Copenhagen, so one of the organisations in the Act Alliance and Local to Global, and supporting SCLR as well. So thanks so much to the panelists and the speakers. Excellent and very informative. Just one kind of reflection from our side and a question, I suppose, to Saddam and then to others more broadly. We recently had the pleasure of the company of Raw Nasser, who's a Sudanese researcher that was working with Local to Global on a learning paper on SCLR in Sudan, and she came to Copenhagen and also other EU member state capitals and engaging with different stakeholders and donors on the paper and on SCLR and the approach. And of course, as you can imagine, one of the key questions from donors is around the reporting and how do we satisfy back donor just requirements that are there, and kind of speaking to how we retrofit the whole system to be able to support this. And one thing that they were particularly interested in was the F system that the ERRs developed for reporting, which has now been adopted actually by the Sudan Humanitarian Fund as well. So OCHA has now taken this on board and has basically said it's fine for them. So OCHA are now funding a DCA partner directly now, so not through us any longer, but directly for SCLR in Sudan. And that's been also helped by this F system. And that's satisfied their donor, their demands, and now other donors are looking into it as well and really interested in it by all accounts. I suppose the question then is, Saddam, like, what was the process there? Was that truly like ERR/mutual aid driven? Was that the groups themselves that came up with that reporting? How was that done in a way that also brought the donor along? And is that something that could be then replicated possibly for other contexts, obviously context adapted for other areas? And is that something that we then as intermediaries can get behind in pushing for donors to normalize this support through systems that make them feel more comfortable?
Saddam. Saddam, can you hear us?
Yes, please.
Did you get the question about the F system?
No, I have not got the question. Please read again. I was answering the question on the chat.
Okay.
Just the process for how it was developed, Saddam, the F system, and was it truly locally led, that the F system, and how did you go about getting back donor support for that as well?
If you
Yeah,
can
F
respond-
system.
Yeah, we are getting out of time, so thank you for a short response, and maybe we will continue, or you will continue after the conclusion.
Yeah. For F system, I think we developed it from the beginning. It was just a small thing in the beginning, just small needs, not matching all the needs that asking for donors. But now, from day to day, since 2023 to date, we develop it in a good way that can, yeah, full of most of the requirement that donor needs. Yeah. And also at the same time, it is easy for our community to fill the needs of from F1 to 4, 5, F2, F3, all of these models of format. It is easy for them to fill, and also the requirements are not really very difficult. And also at the same time, most of the back donors and donors, we meet them, they think that this information is enough, yeah, to guide the fund. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that we have to close our discussion. So thank you very much for the participation and all your inputs, and looking forward to continue soon in other places.